I think it's a very sort of opportune time to have this discussion, I think, for all of us coming from the countries that we come from, and especially also for us as South Africans, and where we find ourselves specifically now. This morning we've asked questions like, what has happened over the last year or so. I think the other question is what happened to the money, and so we do find ourselves at a time where I think people are perplexed. We also find ourselves at a time where things that we've taken for granted for many years are not as they seem anymore, and therefore I think I would also try to reflect on how this translates and how we also think in South Africa on this issue. And speaking on the issue of shared societies, I think if you think back, South Africa about 20 years ago, we were the complete antithesis of what a shared society was, and the transition that we had to go through was one that was political but also economical. So when I go through my paper and I talk to you, I would like to straddle both. I want to look at economic transition, but also keep on referring back to economics, because economic sort of policy can only be leveraged by the political institutions that are in place. So I think before I move to the economic side of things, just a few words also on the political transition in South Africa. What we've seen in 1994 was truly remarkable. It was a bloodless transition to peace. Many people predicted otherwise. I think it is safe to say that still today we have a functioning democracy. The rule of law governs the country. We live in a constitutional state. The kind of transition that we also had was one that tried to be cognizant of the situation that the country found itself in 1994, and therefore we've seen sort of a host of political arrangements to ensure that inclusivity has also become part of political life in South Africa. Therefore, we have a proportional representation system that also allows minorities who at the sort of onset of democracy, really sort of resisted the idea of transition. We've also incorporated in our system of governance two parliamentary houses, one a National Assembly and one a National Council of Provinces, that also takes into account the interests of provinces. So on paper, when you look at the architecture of the South African state, it looks federal, but I think in essence, when one looks at how it's functioning, it is much more of a unitary state. And I would argue that was probably the best arrangement that the country also had to have post the transition, because I think we not only sort of had to de-racialize society, but we also had to incorporate sort of different sort of quasi-homelands, which was called or referred to by the apartheid state as independent homelands, and these had to be reincorporated into the South African state, which had also created a number of tensions within society. And then I think, of course, the big issue was also the racial integration of the post-apartheid South African state. What we've seen is a process of legislation that promoted employment equity, particularly through affirmative action. I think when we look at South Africa today, one will see a civil service that is largely transformed in terms of its racial composition and the representativeness of or representing the demography of South African society. But what we've seen in recent years has also been sort of increasingly people asking questions about the extent to which we pursued the meeting racial targets as opposed to the imperative for skills transfer from one cadre of civil servants to another. Now I want to proceed just to reflect a little on the issue of economic inclusivity in post-apartheid South Africa. A number of surveys have been done in recent years in South Africa. I think one of the most prominent is probably the Afrobarometer survey, but also if one looks at the World Values Survey. And what has become increasingly apparent is that South Africans view democracy and they value democracy essentially for its instrumental value. In other words, what can it deliver to people who have been marginalized for decades and centuries under apartheid? So while the institutional characteristics of the democratic state is important to South Africans, the majority values it for its instrumental or the potential to bring about social change within the country. So the post-apartheid government was largely sort of burdened in a number of ways. Firstly, it had new institutions that at the time had very little legitimacy, and these institutions had to create their legitimacy on the hoof, basically, by delivering and at the same time building the institutions and their legitimacy. The second one is, and this is something that the African National Congress did not, I think, fully appreciate just prior to the transition, was that the South African state was virtually bankrupt, and their economic designs for post-apartheid South Africa largely relied on a sort of government or state-driven process of empowerment of South Africans that have been marginalized for centuries. And when it came to this realization, it had to sort of adapt its approach towards economic transition. Firstly, post 1995, especially between 1995 and 2000, it had to implement a program of fiscal austerity, which also translated into social delivery, but not to the extent that many South Africans expected it to happen. It also saw a process of privatization, which the state sort of euphemistically referred to as the restructuring of state assets. And it also saw the relaxation of a number of protective import tariffs, which also saw unemployment rising as a result of workers losing jobs in uncompetitive industries. And so, this has resulted also in an increase in the unemployment levels to the point that today we have an unemployment level, official unemployment level, of about 25%, or about a quarter of the South African working population. If one uses a more expansive definition of what unemployment entails in South Africa, and you include people who've actually stopped looking for a job, that figure goes up to closer to 35%. So I think one of the mistakes that many observers made sort of post 1994 is to say that the country has experienced jobless growth. That is not exactly the case. What has indeed happened is that the labor market or the economy was just not able to absorb the number of new entrants to the South African labor market, and there has been a number of reasons for this. I think firstly one can refer to the transition that the country also had undergone from the late 80s into the 90s, from a resource-orientated economy to one that is much more service-orientated. And the service-orientated economy requires much more skill. I think if any of you who know something about the South African labour market is that we are seriously challenged in terms of having technical skills that is able to drive the economy. We've got a large supply of low-skilled or unskilled labour, but that does not necessarily meet the needs of the economy. I think a second one is that the boom phase, especially between 2002 and 2006, was driven by consumption growth, and that did not really provide a lot of incentive for creating productive capacity in the South African economy. One did see quite a large sort of growth in the contribution of the financial sector to growth, but that did not necessarily translate in increase in employment. Thirdly, and I think for me personally, this is the big Achilles heel for South Africa and its longer-term prospects for sustainable growth, and it's the question of education. The education system, the broader human resource infrastructure in South Africa is not functioning as it should in terms of producing the kinds of workers that is required by the South African labour market. If one just looks at the cohort of students that left the tertiary schooling system last year in South Africa, if they started their schooling in 2000, our schooling system full duration is about 11 years. Of that cohort that started in 2000, only 38% passed through the system at the end of last year. A very small percentage of those have got the technical skills that the economy requires at the moment, specifically as it relates to sciences and mathematics. So if one then looks at who the beneficiaries have been of post-apartheid economic growth, it has largely been the people that has also benefited prior to the end of apartheid. Those were people who had the skills, who had the educational attributes in order to tap into the areas where the South African economy has got the potential to growth. So it has been largely white South Africans. It has been middle-class South Africans, black, coloured and Indian South Africans that have had the opportunity to access quality education. And then there's also been a cohort of people that have benefited from post-apartheid employment equity legislation, such as affirmative action, which primarily focused on making the workplace more representative of the demography of the country. And then also the other measure that has also been put into legislation, and that's called Black Economic Empowerment, which really focused on ownership within the South African economy. So both have managed to create a degree of integration, but that integration really took place within the formal sector of the economy. There have been sort of criticism against affirmative action in the sense that it, again, the point of an obsession with meeting targets, but not necessarily being able to fill positions with skilled people. There has been sort of some research done in recent years that actually showed that managers within the civil service have rather than appointing somebody in a position that would distort the affirmative action quota, rather not appoint the person at all. And as a result, we've seen also a drain of skills within the civil service in many instances. As far as Black economic empowerment is concerned, I think there is broad consensus across society and also from the ANC's major alliance partners that it has been perversed in a bad way. I think specifically as it relates to who has benefited from this system of economic empowerment. And one has seen that these were mostly people that were politically connected, who either had the political pedigree, in other words, relations within the ANC, or people who bought themselves into this practice. The other criticism has also been that there has been racial fronting, where white businesses actually bought people to come and sit on their boards in order to get the necessary representation, demographic representation on the board, because this was necessary, because government procurement also was largely being determined by the extent to which ownership of certain companies were was in black hands. And I think a final sort of point that one can also mention is the extent, or the question, to which extent this practice has actually helped to create new wealth. Because what one has seen quite often has been that there has been transfers of equity within companies, and you know, these shares were also bought at discount prices by new owners. The question is, to what extent has those really been assisting in creating new economic wealth? So I think the present-day reality of South Africa is that one has seen a reduction in income poverty, and that has largely been a result of revenues that have been redirected from the growth years towards a social security system. And but at the same time, one has also seen a significant increase in inequality in South Africa. I mean, there have been various drivers of inequality, but I think the skills issue is probably one of the primary ones, because what one has seen is that there has been a premium put on skills, which has really sort of driven up the salaries of executives, people in sought-after positions in the engineering sector, for example, the medical sector, technical sector, example. And you know, as a result, those inequalities have been driven up within society itself, but also within the country's sort of historically defined racial sort of categories. And it still is sort of difficult to explain this, but in apartheid South Africa, we had a distinction between black South Africans, South Africans of Indian origin, and South Africans of mixed origin, and then white South Africans. So when we still measure equity in South Africa and transfer of wealth, we still use these categories. But so we've seen also an increase of inequality within these groups as well. So today we have a situation where, as a result of the reinforcement of apartheid patterns of redistribution in society, we've seen that that income inequality has gone down somewhat, but largely as a result of social transfers. About 15 million South Africans today receive some form of social grant or pension from the South African state, which amounts to about a third of the South African population. This is still under under 4% of our South African GDP. The question is how sustainable this is in the longer term. I think there has definitely been merit in these grants being there. It has, and there has also been research showing that that it has had a stabilizing impact on South African society. Also, that it, in some instances, assisted some people to start their own sort of small businesses in the informal sector. The question is how sustainable it is, because this number of 15 million recipients of services or welfare services in South Africa is about a 500% increase from what it was in 1996. So we can simply not afford to expand the system at that same level. So I think when one then looks at the overall picture, this trajectory is I think it is plain to see it's simply unsustainable, and therefore it is necessary also to think for the South African society about how we are going to adapt to this reality. What we've seen is an approach where it has been assumed that if we de-racialize the South African economy, things will translate into a more equitable society in the long term. We have not necessarily seen that, and therefore the questions need to be asked: how are we going to adapt structurally in the longer term? And over the past 2 years, one has seen, I think, a much more intense kind of engagement with those questions, with a new growth framework that has been released about 2 years ago, and then also last year the release of a draft national development plan for up to 2030. I think that the reason why it is important to reflect on both political, social, and economic aspects in this paper is because the three are so intertwined. If one looks at the patterns of redistribution in post-apartheid South Africa, one sees that it has largely entrenched a pattern that existed prior to apartheid, with a little sort of a small degree of growth within the black middle class, but not substantial or to the degree that one would have liked. And this has not only impacted sort of on the class dynamic. Of course, one has seen the schism between classes becoming even bigger. But if one also looks at how it has impacted on society, post-apartheid South Africa is still such that most South Africans live in the neighborhoods where they used to live before the end of apartheid. So these are sort of largely racially homogeneous neighborhoods. So patterns of socialization are also being entrenched by economic patterns of distribution. And I think you will see in graphs 5 and 6 in my paper, I've just included some data from an annual survey that we do at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And you will see, I think in graph 5, the low levels of contact that still exist between South Africans of different historically defined racial categories. Just in terms of ordinary contact, the extent to which ordinary citizens just talk to each other on a daily basis, and even less so in terms of the degree to which people interact with each other after work at their homes or the homes of friends. And graph 6 is also, I think, very interesting, I think, to us, and that is that one sees that where integration occurs, where people socialize, where they talk to each other, this mainly occurs in the higher income categories. So the imperative, therefore, I think, for a more inclusive society, a society that talks to each other, that engages with each other about its very divisive past, but also about its future, is that the current patterns of distribution, wealth distribution in our society, actually mitigates against that. And I think that is then also, I think, one of the big imperatives for a rethink of how we approach the South African economy. It reinforces patterns. And if one just looks at the very small size of the South African middle class, in other words, the people who work in the informal or in the formal economy that is integrated as a result of affirmative action and employment equity, that is a very, very small section of the South African population. I've also, in the last table in this paper that I included, is also just a table that reports on some findings also of the South African Reconciliation Barometer survey that we do every year. And it just shows that this, the impact that inequality has on South African society is also very visible to ordinary South Africans. I think if you asked South Africans about 20 years ago what you regard as the major source of division in South Africa, most people would have said race would have been the primary issue. When we ask people today, the response is income inequality in South Africa. And of course, I think one should not make the mistake to say that the issue of race has not, or is no longer important, because they largely still do intersect. But I think what is significant is that if one asks people to identify one single issue or aspect or phenomenon of South African society, then it is that. So I think to conclude, I think what one has seen in South Africa, and what one should be cautious of also when one looks north, northwards into Africa, is that growth has got the potential to promote cohesion within a society, but it can also, if not managed properly, can also be disruptive to a large extent. One should not assume that cosmetic things like a deracialization in society, or I think if one looks northwards in Africa, equity along ethnic lines, or whatever might be the case, that such kinds of legislation would automatically solve the very structural problems that these societies have. Very sort of ironically, last week we celebrated Human Rights Day in South Africa, and I think not coincidentally, we've seen sort of a resurgence of a wave of social protests across the country against what people in poor communities call poor service delivery. In other words, people not being able to access things that they assumed should have been given within a post-apartheid South Africa. We've seen this manifest in relation of communities towards local government, but also on an inter-ethnic basis, where people of different sort of racial groups have engaged in conflict with each other based on the premise that one group has benefited to the detriment of the other. The irony of this is that these conflicts play themselves out between communities that have been marginalized under apartheid, while this still sort of coexists right sort of alongside a section of the South African community that lives in affluence and lives to a large extent worlds apart from people in their own country. I think that's it.